Hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Teresa Scandifio. I'm Director of Adult Learning here at TIFF Lightbox. Welcome to In Conversation with Kevin Macdonald. Just going to start with some quick housekeeping, and then we'll get this party started because we have a lot we want to talk about. On behalf of TIFF, I'd like to thank our lead sponsor, Bell, our major sponsors, RBC, L'Oreal Paris, and Visa, and our major public supporters, Government of Canada, Government of Ontario, and the City of Toronto. In addition, we'd love to thank tonight's media partner, the Toronto Star, and our community partner for this event, the Hot Docs Canadian International Documentary Festival. We'd also like to thank donors and members like you for supporting TIFF's charitable mission to bringing the power of film to life 365 days a year. Please keep your phones on silent. Taking photos or recording video is not allowed at any point during the event, but we encourage you to tweet afterwards with the hashtag ICWMacdonald. And during the Q&A, we ask that you wait for the microphone before you ask your question, and also really make sure that your phone is off so we don't get that weird bounce back. We could not be happier to present tonight's event. Kevin Macdonald has had a very close connection to TIFF going back to '98 when his doc, Donald Camel, The Ultimate Performance, screened at the festival. In 1999, he won the Academy Award for Best Doc Feature for One Day in September, his gripping documentary about the hostage crisis at the 1972 Munich Olympics. Since then, several of his films, both incisive documentaries and acclaimed narrative features, have premiered here in Toronto, including Touching the Void, The Last King of Scotland, and How I Live Now. He joins us today to discuss his career and impressive filmography, so please join me in welcoming Kevin Macdonald to the stage.
Thank you, thank you.
So for those of you who are new to the format, the way it works is in 1 hour, we're going to try to cover a very prolific filmmaker's career. So there are obviously going to be just a few handful of clips that we'll use to kind of jump on major themes or major subject matters of interest to him. But of course, we then open it up to all of you. So there will be half an hour for all of your brilliant questions, not statements, for us, so we can have a really...
Statements.
Okay, fine, they can be... Now I'm the bad guy, great. Your brilliant statements about documentary, about fiction film, about all things Kevin Macdonald. So we have a lot, or there's potentially a lot of different things that we can jump off on. There are a lot of filmmakers in the audience. Can you tell us about who know your fiction filmmaking, your documentary, but they might not know how you started and how you started with writing books. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about how you made that leap and how you got from writing?
Well, I wanted to be a journalist when I was at university, and in fact before that I wanted to be a journalist, and I left Oxford University with an English degree and couldn't get a job anywhere. And now I'm grateful I didn't go into journalism, since I would probably be unemployed at the moment. Since that's what most journalists are suffering these days. But it was really through my interest in, I guess, real-life stories that I started making little documentaries for fun with my brother, who is now a film producer. At the time, was not a producer. And the two of us had a little Hi-8 camera, which was the greatest high-tech thing in 1991 or something. It was the first kind of domestic video camera that you could buy if you weren't very rich, that gave pretty decent quality images. And we ran around with that and made lots of little short documentaries. But my interest was really a journalistic one. I was interested in certain kind of issues, political or current affairs kind of issues. But through making these little documentaries just for fun, I got the film bug. And I also was writing about film at the time, because actually I come from a kind of family where several people in my family have been involved in film, and most notably my grandfather, who is Emmerich Pressburger, Powell and Pressburger, who are legends of British cinema. My grandfather was the kind of writer in that partnership. And so I'd grown up with a sort of, a love of film in the family. But my grandfather's films were very much forgotten at that time. In the 1980s, nobody was interested in those films at all. They weren't shown at all. And when he died in 1988, I remember going around to various people saying, somebody should write a book about him, but nobody was interested. And then I met a very lovely publisher called Walter Donahue, who I think has come here to TIFF before. He said to me, oh, you should write it. And I thought, well, I'm not really qualified, but since I was unemployed, I thought I might as well do something. So I started writing this book about my grandfather, which really was the thing that brought me into filmmaking proper, because I had to watch a lot of movies about, he started in the 1920s in Germany, the famous UFA studios there, and then he moved to France and then to England. I had to watch lots and lots of movies from the 20s through to the 50s, and I got my film education history doing that. I wrote this book, and then I wrote another book about documentaries, and so really through kind of writing about film, I started to get interested in practicing it and wanting to try my own hand at it.
So that's when you started getting into documentary biographies and historical, major historical moments.
Yeah, I mean, I started off just working for the BBC and for other broadcasters in Britain, making television documentaries about artists and filmmakers and that kind of thing. And then I was so bowled over in the mid-90s by a few American documentaries that came out, Hoop Dreams and Crumb and When We Were Kings, in particular, the Muhammad Ali film. I went to see those at the cinema, and it was a totally new thing for me, and I think for most people in Britain, to go to the cinema to watch a documentary. And I remember watching them and thinking, I really want to do that. That is so amazing, to actually have a cinematic experience that is true life, is documentary. And so then I made this film about Donald Cammell, who was a very curious, dark filmmaker who made performance and was a painter and all sorts of things. And then I made One Day in September. And very much the aim in making that film, One Day in September, was I want to make a documentary that will be on at the cinema. And everybody in Britain was like, no, documentaries, maybe a few American documentaries go on at the cinema, but British documentaries don't. We've got such great documentaries on television, and that's where they belong. And so we really had to fight a lot to persuade people to give us the money to do that film. And that was the sort of start of my career, making that film, One Day in September.
Why don't we start with that clip, a clip from One Day in September, and then we'll talk about this ambitious project and how you made it. So this film, you won an Academy Award for it, but when you're going to start making it, you're talking about how you want to have a theatrical release. And in writings and in discussions about this film, you've talked about how you were influenced by Oliver Stone. Did that feed into how you pitched a theatrical release? Yeah,
very much so. Because again, that was JFK had come out a few years before. Weirdly, I'm now currently in Toronto working on a TV show which is about JFK. So that's a kind of strange circularity. But JFK had just come out. And that used, obviously, a very memorable and brilliant way, archive mixed in with dramatizations. And so that was very much in my mind, thinking about a kind of new style of documentary, or what seemed to me to be a new style of documentary, which was a thriller documentary. Could you make something that would really operated like a thriller, like JFK, but actually was all real? And that's what we tried to do. And I think. It's got kind of this very heavy score going on most of the time through the documentary, which now I kind of think is a bit much. But at the time, it was this propulsive thing, wanting to sort of do that. And a lot of people in the documentary world were sort of a bit appalled by this film, and because they felt that it was too manipulative, that it was trying too hard to be narrative, that it took too many kind of tropes from fiction filmmaking, I suppose, and used them in documentary. But first and foremost, it was a journalistic endeavor. I heard about this story. I mean, it happened in a roundabout way. I think in a way that is opposite to the way that most documentaries start, which is most documentaries start because it's with somebody finding a subject and thinking, I want to make a documentary about that. This was, I wanted to make a documentary thriller. What can I make it about? So there was something a bit unusual about that. But I looked with the producer, John Batzik, various different stories, and we read an article about the Munich Olympic Games and some of the mysteries still surrounding it, and the campaign for justice that the families of the athletes who died were still undergoing. And I went to meet some of those families in Munich, and they were fascinating and full of incredible conspiracies and things, loose ends to the whole story. It's one of the, it's the greatest, I suppose, terrorist attack at a sporting event, at any public event. It changed the whole way that security is done at airports. There was security done at all sporting events. It was a huge turning point in terrorism, this event. And yet, there were so many loose ends, so many things that people didn't know about. And so I thought that's fascinating. So it became this investigation. And we spent a couple of years investigating it, persuading people to talk, like this German policeman here, who had very embarrassing and comical stories in a way to tell, that they'd dressed up as athletes and got on the roof of the Olympic Village and completely, they were so amateurish. And then I worked with an editor who I've continued to work with since then, called Justine Wright, who came from a world of commercials, and she had never made a documentary before, and I'd never made a feature documentary before, and really the two of us kind of created this propulsive narrative. But
it also was incredibly, like, the unrelenting research you put into it. Perhaps one of the biggest hooks is one of the eyewitness accounts you get is of one of the hostage, Jamal al-Ghashi from Black September. How did you convince, he's still in hiding at this point.
Yeah.
How do you convince him to do a documentary that's going to have theatrical release?
I don't think he would have, he probably didn't know what a documentary was, let alone a theatrical release documentary.
I'm being facetious, but when someone's in hiding, and obviously there are a lot of theories going on, how did you get him, how did you convince him to participate in this?
People here have probably seen, you've probably seen the Steven Spielberg film Munich, which is really, I like to call it the sequel to my documentary. But it's about the story of happens after this, which is about hunting down the people who committed this atrocity. And there were 3 survivors, and one of the most amazing parts of the whole story, which is detailed in the documentary, is about how these 3 hostage takers were arrested, they were badly wounded, and then instead of being put in prison in Germany, they were released 3 weeks later in exchange for the passengers of a hijacked jet. And there's all sorts of stories which are again in the film, that jet the hijacking was actually done in cooperation with the German government. They didn't want to have these 3 Palestinian terrorists on their hands, and they knew that there was going to be future attacks, and they were told supposedly by the PLO, if you let them go, we won't do any actions on German soil again. And they did. But that's where the sort of Spielberg film takes up, which is that Mossad then sent assassination teams, effectively, out to try and find the people who had planned this and executed it, this action in Munich. And they killed lots of people, I think about 11 people. And the only one of the 3 survivors from who was actually on the ground, of the 7 terrorists who were on the ground in Munich, is Jamal al-Ghashi, who appears in the documentary. And I had heard from one of the Israeli families of the victims that she had heard that he was alive, and that somebody had met him and talked to him, and she didn't know where he was. And I talked to lots and lots of journalists, and I found a Palestinian journalist who said, I went to school with him. We grew up in the same refugee camp in Lebanon, in Saida, and he said, I think I can find him for you. And this journalist happened to be very well connected in the PLO, and he found him, and we started a negotiation, and he was in hiding, and I think I can probably now say, it's because it's a long time later, it's that he was in Tunisia, and we were planning originally to make a lot of the film about him and really focus the whole film around him. But then the political situation changed. The PLO started to tell him, no, don't want you to take part in the film. Because we were originally making the documentary at just a particular moment in 1997-8 when Ehud Barak was Prime Minister of Israel. There was a liberalization, a sense that there was going to be a resolution to the Arab-Israeli question. It was only lasted for like 6 months, but everyone was very optimistic. And so a lot of Palestinians, a lot of people who were in hiding, like Jamal, decided that this was a time to tell their side of the story and come out into the open And so he started negotiating with us, and then he pulled back, and then in the end, the journalist managed to persuade him just to do one interview in shadow. And that was, that became in a way the centerpiece to the documentary.
When you look at Kevin's career, there's a pattern of him convincing people to do interviews or convincing them to participate in films that are highly emotionally charged for them. I'm thinking of the next film we'll talk about, Touching the Void. Mm-hmm. How you have this, you know, incredible story about these two climbers who barely survive climbing this mountain in the Peruvian Andes, and you somehow convince them to participate in a documentary going through the details of it. I'm wondering if we could show the clip of Touching the Void, his 2003 documentary, and then we'll talk a little bit more about his ability to convince participants and style of filmmaking. So, yeah, if you haven't seen this film, you have to see. Yeah, we're letting you off easy. It's a Saturday afternoon. This is truly an immersive experience. You have all kinds of different approaches to how you use your research materials in documentary film. Why did you choose to do a reenactment?
Well, up until this point, I'd been very purist about documentary, really, and didn't really like the idea of making fiction myself, and didn't really, I kind of hated those television programs that used reenactment and always felt it was cheesy and kind of dishonest. And then I read this story, and I thought, I absolutely must make a documentary about this. It's a fantastic story to make a documentary about, but of course there's no footage. How do you do it? You have to use reenactment. And in a way, that was coming to terms with that myself was my entry into making fiction films, in a way. So I cast a couple of actors who looked somewhat like the real people in this story, and the whole documentary is made up of a combination of just interviews with three people, just talking heads, big talking heads, and this reenactment and kind of landscape beauty shots, I suppose. It's a kind of pure storytelling. It's just about, it's like sitting down around a campfire with somebody and they tell you the most amazing story, and that's what I wanted it to be. I just thought, I don't want it to be cluttered up with too much about character or too much about thematics. I want it just to be an amazing, tense story from beginning to end.
So you talked about the different philosophies, or certain styles having a purist tendency.
Yeah.
It's also known that when you involved Simon and Joe in the process and the production, that it became, off camera, it became a little bit emotional, a little bit heated.
Yes.
Can you tell us why you decided to not turn the camera on that?
Well, it's interesting because at the time well, I should tell everyone that what happened was I went back to this very remote region of the Andes in Peru called the Cordillera Huayhuash, which is about 4 days walk from the nearest little town, and you really are in the middle of nowhere, which is where this mountain Ciudad Grande is. And I went back there with the film crew and took Joe and Simon, who are the two characters who are in the movie, with me, and they came as consultants. They came not to be in the film, but to be consultants, to tell us where things happened and what happened. But what became obvious as we got closer and closer to the mountain was that there was a lot of baggage that they each had still about this event, and in their lives it was a defining moment, I suppose. And for those of you who don't know the story, the crux of it, which is about to happen after that clip, is that the guy holding the rope, he holds on and he holds on and he holds on, and then he takes out a knife and he cuts the rope, and he sends his friend to his death. He thinks to his death, but it turns out that he manages to survive, and it's an incredible sort of survival story about how that one character survives. But Simon, who cut the rope, had been vilified in climbing circles. Is famous still now for being, the guy who cut the rope, which is the one thing you should never do if you're a climber. You can't cut the rope, and that's the bond of trust between climbers. And they had never really sorted this out between them. They'd sort of remained friends, but not really. And
well, you notice it's like each of them are individually shot in their interview. So they're talking about how there's no tension, but they're not beside each other.
No, no. And I felt like there was something just about, so when we got there, I did have a camera to film kind of behind the scenes footage or whatever, which is on a little DVD extra on the DVD. And the producer kept saying to me, you know, when I got back, oh, you have to make that the film. You have to make the film about them going back. And I said, well, that's a television documentary. That's the film that is you know, would be on at 9 o'clock at night and a 50-minute film. But we want to try and make a cinematic experience. And the bigger story is the story of what happened to them, and the subtext that will come across will be in their interviews, because I'm a great believer that you can't lie in an interview, really. Even if you're trying to lie, you can't really lie. The audience know what's going on. They can read your character so well in your face and in your eyes. And I think all of that tension between them comes across in the interviews, even though they don't ever really talk about it, and they don't really, and you never see them together, and you never see them alive. So I think sometimes I think it's the case, isn't it, in filmmaking, as in I guess a lot of other arts, that somehow giving yourself limitations, very strong limitations, actually makes the material more powerful, rather than if you sort of show all your hand, you know, immediately, then there's nowhere else to go. There's no tension involved.
I think a lot of people, you know, were waiting to think, how on earth would these climbers do this again, and then not realize until the credits that it was actors as well. There's also this whole tension of being like, why would someone...
It's very useful when you've got those, you know, hideous 1980s Gore-Tex jackets and things up over your head and everything, in snow blurring. You know, you can't really tell if these are the real people or not. So that's a big big tick in the advantage box of making this kind of documentary.
So you're talking about your foray, kind of inching in or blurring the lines between nonfiction and fiction, which segues to the next film that we'll just touch upon, which is the Last King of Scotland.
Yeah.
And how you undertake this huge, ambitious challenge of, again, it's a fiction film, but it's based on the true story of Ugandan dictator.
Yeah.
And again, there's his doctor who's kind of the witness,
yes,
one of many witnesses.
Yeah.
Let's show a clip from The Last King of Scotland, and then we'll talk about this film specifically, into the distinctions that you have and how you approach fiction film. Probably should have set that scene up for you to also say, if you haven't seen The Last King of Scotland, it's a pivotal scene where we really can see that the doctor is finally getting that Idi Amin's, you know, cycle into madness and the level of danger that abounds. In a lot of articles and interviews, you've talked about when you are, you know, entering into fiction or entering into documentary, that you'll often get lessons, unsolicited or solicited, from filmmakers who are, you know, built careers in one way or the other.
Yeah.
You mentioned that when you were making Last King of Scotland, Danny Boyle kind of became like a mini film school instead of some advice for you.
Yeah.
Can you mention some of the tips that he gave, and if you just blatantly ignored them?
I should say I know Danny a bit because, well, I know him quite well. I haven't seen him for a while, but he made a lot of films with my brother, who's a producer, and he made Train Spotting and Shallow Grave and The Beach, various films together. So I knew him through that. And so when I decided to make this film, I'd literally not really been on a film set before. I'd never made a short film. I'd only made documentaries, and I thought, you know, the week before I left for Uganda to make the film, I thought, I better find out something about how you make a film. And I arranged to have coffee with Danny and said, will you give me the half-hour film school? What should I do?
I love that you gave him a time limit.
Well, I think he was probably busy. I think that, I can't remember all the things that he said to me, but I did write them down assiduously. I should have kept those notes, shouldn't I? But I do remember him talking, for instance, about very just simple technical things about when to go to close up on somebody and when to have a full frontal close up, and that at those moments that you deem to be so emotionally important. Because I was saying to him, I'm going to shoot it all kind of documentary style, and we're always going to be in profiles, and the camera is going to be sort of moving in a documentary fashion. And he said, be very careful of that. Be very careful that you also do these proper close-ups at emotional moments. Otherwise, you will find that that the emotion of the movie and the empathy with the characters is very hard to come by. And so that was something I took on board, and we shot in that more conventional way quite a lot of moments in the movie, which I was very grateful for. And you've got two great actors there, James McAvoy and Forrest Whitaker, who really work in close-up. And so that was one thing. And he talked about eye lines, and he told me about the basic simple things about when somebody is looking left and when somebody's looking right, and how to match that on the other side. So I didn't know any of these things.
So how did you get this job? I mean, this is a pretty high-profile, high-budget film. I
don't know really. Well, the funny thing was, you see, that I'd had great success with two films. So I'd made one in September, won an Oscar, and then Touching the Void had won lots of awards and made a lot of money actually. And so suddenly people were saying, "Oh, do you want to make a fiction film?" And I thought, well, I'm not sure I do really, but there was this book I read called The Last Game of Scotland, which is kind of a fictional story set in the real world, and I thought, well, I should take this opportunity since people are offering me the chance. So here's $5 million, go and make a film. I should take the opportunity, and that was really, as much as anything else, that's what it was. I thought this probably won't happen again. And so it was kind of crazy situation in a way, because I didn't know that much, but I had a fantastic director of photography who was Danny Boyle's director of photography, Anthony Dodmantle, and a fantastic crew. And we took about 15 people from Britain over to Uganda, and the rest of the crew were all Ugandans, most of whom had never been on a film set either. So we were equal in that regard. And so they were, the makeup people and costume people were all people who just worked in, makeup, hair stands on the side of the road, or worked in, making suits for people, things like that. They did the costumes. And so we had a costume designer from Britain. But so it was kind of had this homemade quality to it, which was really fantastic and really lovely. And we worked in a very cheap way. And a lot of the places the story is a Dr. Faustus kind of story. It's about getting too close to power and not recognizing when you're being compromised and you're losing your moral center of gravity, and which is what happens to the central character played by James McAvoy. And a little bit of that happened to us as we were making the film, because we were making the film in Uganda with the permission and the help of Yoweri Museveni, who was the president, who at the time was in his third term in government, and he changed already the number of terms that he could have twice, I think. But he was people still liked him, thought he was a good thing. He'd got rid of Amin in the end. But now I have to tell you, 10 years later, he's still in power, and it's a terrible dictatorship there. But we used his help to be able to film in the Parliament buildings where Amin had been, film in Amin's house, use Amin's limousine, all this sort of stuff. So we used, it was very much rooted in a real world. So there was this kind of documentary element feeding into the fiction element of it. But I was very lucky, and I learned a lot. As not many people get to have a film school making a film, and I feel like that's still where I am with. I understand how documentaries work in a way, but fiction, I'm still kind of feeling my way, and that's what I like about doing fiction in a way, is that you're constantly learning. And I never went to film school, so I'm discovering new things every time I make a piece of fiction.
And you rely on some of the things that are solid for you, like the research that you did on him and how you knew how to approach the story, or on location shooting and different kinds of ways that you can have some kind of grounding for when you experiment, so you're not just going completely
oh no, absolutely. I mean, I think with all the films that I make, and particularly with Last Game of Scotland, it's based on a lot of research, and I probably to a fault want to know what the real thing is like before I try and put it on film in a fictional context. So I don't think I could ever make a pure fantasy film I wouldn't know quite where to start. I think I want to read a few books first about the subject, and if there aren't a few books, then I probably wouldn't be able to do it.
So the next film that we are going to talk about is focuses on the life of Bob Marley. Let's dive right into the clip, and then we will talk about how you approach. So I will set this one up. Bob Marley is in Zimbabwe, and it shows great archival footage. There's a new president sworn in, and the footage is also a testament to how Marley gets lost in his stage performances, but then also one other goal, which I think you've talked about, is that not just a music legend, but also kind of like a key figure and a leader in this scene. So if you could please show this clip. So this is another example of where a lot of people have attempted or tried to make films, documentaries about Marley, but have not been able to get access to all of the research, to all of his inner circle. How did this documentary come about? Did you know that you were going to get access to his family and to everyone?
Well, funnily enough, the origins of this documentary were really, for me, in my time spent in Uganda, because I was so amazed that wandering around the poorer sections of Kampala, that there were murals of Marley everywhere, and you heard reggae everywhere, and particularly heard Marley everywhere. And it was the first time I'd sort of realized the significance of him as a cultural figure and as a sort of philosopher, I suppose, to the dispossessed of the world, and particularly, obviously, in Africa, but really everywhere in the world. And I think he's such a, you know, a lot of people don't like reggae or don't like Marley because of the connotations, the associations of Rastafarianism, drug use, or whatever. But I think he's such a massively important cultural figure who's been underestimated. And just the very fact that he is the only superstar of the arts who comes from the developing world. The only superstar in music comes from the developing world. Everyone else comes from, you know, Britain or North America, pretty much exclusively, maybe a little France, a little bit Germany. He grew up, you know, sleeping on a dirt floor in a shack in Jamaica, and then has had this huge influence and spread this huge message around the world. So I saw that in Kampala, and I tried to make the film about him then, after that, and it didn't work out because there are famously lots of rights issues and family sort of arguments between the different members of the Marley family. He had 11 children. He died without a will. They've all got a right to vote on it, and it's very messy. And I forgot about making the film. I should say actually that, you know, I love his music, but I'm more fascinated by him as a phenomenon actually, and that was what I wanted to get at. And then out of the blue, about 4 years ago, whatever, I was contacted by a producer in LA, Steve Bing, who had got the rights to make a documentary about Marley, and had been trying to do it for several years, and had hired several other filmmakers. In fact, I was the third director that he'd hired to do this, and I was clearly way down the shopping list because he started with Martin Scorsese, and then he went to Jonathan Demme, and then me. So, you know, I was cheaper, and Jonathan Demme had gone quite a long way into trying to make a film, and then the film had been abandoned. Scorsese had only done a little bit, and it was kind of this sort of mess. And I think I came in at the right moment, which was when everyone was just desperate to make a film. And so I went to see Ziggy Marley, who's really the sort of I guess the guardian of the legacy, and had a meeting with him, and was just very frank about, you know, I don't want to get caught up in. I made a film before this about Mick Jagger and the Rolling Stones, which was a sort of fantastic, the most fun I've ever had in my life, but jetting around the world with Mick Jagger, but the worst film I've ever made in my life because it got recut, I didn't have final cut, and it was all a sort of nightmare. And I thought, I'm not doing that again, I don't want to do that again. So I just said, you know, you have to trust me to just, you know, make the film I want to make, and I want, you know, I love what your father represents. I love him, and I'm not going to be disrespectful of him, but I'm going to be honest about him. And he said yes, and we won't interfere. And he was as good as his word. He gave me everything. The members of the family, a couple of people had problems with things in the film, and I said, well, you know, I want to keep them. I think they're important, and they let me. stay as it was, and they let me use 50 songs. And because I started making this film, and so many people had tried before, and Marley has been really so weirdly kind of ignored, I think, in some ways, in terms of being taken seriously. As I started to interview people in his inner circle, and travel around Jamaica and around the world meeting people, I realized that there's the only time in my documentary making career where I thought, I've got a huge responsibility here to posterity, that actually this is probably the only time a film is going to be made about this guy who is hugely important. And these people, who most of whom are, they all hate each other, and they're all saying, I won't talk if he talks. And all this, but they all, for whatever reason, the stars aligned, everybody talked. And I sort of felt like I'm making a piece of history. Mm-hmm. And so I ended up making the film very long. It's like 2 hours, 40 minutes long, which some people were kind of appalled by, the distributors were appalled by. But it just felt like, I have to put, not everything in, but I have to put a lot into this, and it needs to be something that is of historical value in a way. And also just to tell the story of a man's life, even though he died young, is, it's hard to capture who they are. And the biggest challenge was making a film about somebody which there's practically no archive footage. I think there's 2 photographs of him before he's 20 years old. There's the first bit of footage is when he's 28 years old, and there's probably 10 minutes of interview footage in toto with him, most of which he's stoned out of his mind in, and doesn't make any sense. So that was a real technical challenge of how to make a documentary when you don't have all the things, a historical documentary, when you don't have all the usual tools at your disposal, and it becomes kind of an oral history. And so, you've got great music and you've got people telling you stories, and they're great Jamaicans are just great talkers in general. And so it was a lot of pleasure to make.
I have a lot more questions about this one specifically, also thinking about, how it would have been shaped differently if you decided to do a biopic, or if you had done, different, but I'm cognizant of the people in the corner over there telling me to keep it moving. So we are going to show our final clip. We're going to skip over the 5th one, and we're going to go straight to Black Sea. Yeah. And if you could show that clip, and then we'll talk about the challenges of shooting in a submarine. So when we spoke in preparation for this conversation about what clips to include and what films to include, we landed on this scene from Black Sea. Do you want to tell the audience why it resonates with you?
Well, I was expecting it to go on. I was expecting it to go on a little bit longer, but I just thought it's a good clip because it illustrates, especially if it goes on a bit longer, the difficulties of making a film like this. We wanted to make a submarine film, which is not it's not an everyday sort of thing that you get to do, is to make a submarine film. But we had very little money, and we had to use a real submarine for some of it, which is incredibly difficult to shoot in. It was an old Russian submarine, which is a part of the story of the film. And shooting inside it was, the most limiting you can imagine. It's like making a movie in a cupboard, basically. And there's just a tube with a corridor in it, and everybody just has to stand. You get more than 3 people together, and you've just got backs, and that's it. There's nothing else. It's very hard to shoot, but that claustrophobia also gives a tremendous suspense to the story and tension to the story. And we used in the film combination of real bits of submarine, VFX submarine, like the aerial shot there at the beginning where you see was real water, when there was a tugboat there when we shot it, and it was replaced with a digital submarine, bits of green screen, and if we'd gone on a little bit further, you see bits of set as well. So it was kind of an interesting, for me, just sort of technically, it was a different kind of film, a real problem-solving on a low budget to make a something work through all these different technical components, I suppose. That was why I was interested.
And Justine Wright, your longtime editor, also helped you, or edited this film.
Yeah.
How did the two of you decide that you would, how you would collaborate on this? Because I know that you're also fascinated by editing. How did you collaborate on this one?
Well, I love working with Justine because she's like such a tough critic, and you give her your dailies, and she is brutally honest always, and you come away feeling like, oh, I failed her in some way. But she's also amazingly inventive and creative as an editor. She's won a lot of awards recently for a film that she did called Locke, which is an amazing piece of inventive editing, which is one man, Tom Hardy, sitting in a car for the entire movie. And this was not far off that in terms of, people would think of editing as being about, fast cuts and flashy editing and that sort of way. But actually the hardest editing is how to use very limited resources, limited angles, and tell a story really effectively, like she did in Locke or in this film.
Another exercise in editing is the crowdsourcing film that you made.
Yes.
A Life in the Day.
Yeah.
Can you talk about how that project came about and how you decided to take 4,000 hours into 90 minutes?
Yeah, so that film, Life in a Day, which you can see on YouTube for free, is a film that I was fascinated to do because YouTube basically came to me and said, we'd like to make a film that sort of celebrates who we are after 5 years of living in business for 5 years or whatever, and you can do anything you like. And so what we did was we came up with this concept of, let's ask people all around the world, anyone who wants to film on a single day and trying to create a portrait of the world in one day. Now, obviously, it's sort of, you're bound to fail right from the start there because not everybody has access to a camera, not everybody has access to even internet to be able to upload whatever they shoot. But we tried to get around that by we bought 500 little cameras and sent them off around the world to kind of parts of the world where they don't have digital cameras and they don't have internet, to try and make it a bit more representative. But it's a film which I suppose is a new kind of documentary. It's a documentary made purely of found footage, but found footage which is then sourced through the internet, and it creates this sort of mosaic perspective of the world and this snapshot of the world. And I think it's a sort of great time capsule. We made it in 2010. It was shot on, my God, what was it? 22nd of July, something like that. 24th of July, 2010. So I think in 20 years' time, 30 years' time, 40 years' time, you'll look back and see, oh, there's one day on Earth. There's one day of life. And that was a huge editing task. We had 5,000 hours of material from 192 countries around the world. We had 22 assistant editors who spoke lots of different languages. We had, it was a huge organizational task, and led by wonderful editor Joe Walker on that instance, not Justine Wright, who is a great drama editor usually, and who did 12 Years a Slave, and what else has he done? Sicario, that just did very well at Cannes. He's a wonderful editor. And what was so interesting about doing that film was that most of my movies are about strong narrative, and that has no narrative at all. And it has a musical structure. It's a structure that's like, a symphony or something. It goes in waves and repetitions and themes. So that was really a joyful experience to make.
So let's talk about your current project. You're working, this is in a lot of ways full circle in your topic about JFK, in it being an adaptation, but a huge historical moment, all of these kind of themes, and then also a brand new platform for you with Hulu. Can you talk a little bit about your current project? Yeah,
so I'm here doing the first 2 episodes of a TV show, which was a 9-hour show called 11/22/63, which is based on a Stephen King book of the same name. It came out 2-3 years ago, and it's my first foray into television, and so that's been exciting and different and challenging in some ways. I was sent the script by Bridget Carpenter, who I might be in here tonight, who had written a beautiful script, a beautiful adaptation of a very hard book to adapt, because, you know, like a lot of Stephen King's books, it's enormous and very wordy and kind of has a leisurely approach to narrative, I suppose, and she's made it into something that really, you know, you fly through in 9 hours. So I suppose like a lot of directors, I'm feeling like, you know, so much interesting stuff is going on in television. There's so much interesting writing in television, and so it feels like it's a great time to be trying that out. But also the JFK thing was obviously attractive to me. I like conspiracy. For those of you who don't know, the story is about a man who, played by James Franco, who finds a sort of rabbit hole, he calls it, a kind of a warp hole back in time to 1960, and he decides to go back to 1960 in order to prevent the assassination of JFK. So he sort of goes on this kind of detective story to try and figure out who killed JFK and to stop it. I think it's very unusual for a Stephen King book as well, in that it's got this kind of element of being really a historical novel. It's filled with, you know, great detail about the period, and really luxuriates in all the kind of brand names and the cars and all of that sort of sense of what that time was like in America, which makes it very cinematic.
So do you hear Oliver Stone in your head?
No. Luckily, that's the last episode where JFK gets killed or not killed, and I'm not doing that, so I don't have to worry about that. About competing with JFK, competing with Oliver Stone.
So let's open it up now to the audience. Just wait for the lights to go up and for a microphone before you ask your question or say your brilliant statement. I can't really see. Are there any questions?
No questions.
There's one right there.
Hello. In seeing things on HBO like The Jinx, where you're allowed to tell a longer investigative documentary story, do you have any interest in doing like a 10-parter or something that could take years of your life?
I would, if I could find the right story. I mean, that's the thing about documentary, isn't it? That you're kind of at the mercy of good fortune and finding a good story. You know, you can't just go and write it, or often sort of, you know, adapt a book. It doesn't work like that. So, I mean, I had mixed feelings about The Jinx, actually. I don't know, just to be controversial, whether or not it was. I thought it was quite ambiguous in what the motivation of the filmmakers were, and I didn't really understand why they were making it and what they hoped to get out of it. And I felt like a lot of films that I wanted the personal element of it to come through. I wanted to know why Andrew Jarecki, is that his name? I wanted to know why he wanted to make that. Why had he made a feature film about this guy, and now why was he giving years of his life to this story, which is a pretty dark, seedy, you know, unpleasant kind of story. And I thought that was actually would have been more interesting than rehashing some of the same things that been seen before. And I think it doesn't, in comparison, I shouldn't be criticizing another filmmaker's work, should I? But, you know, what the heck. In comparison to The Thin Blue Line, which is obviously the model for all of those kind of documentaries, the Errol Morris film, I felt that it didn't live up to that model, which is what it was aspiring to. So I think it's very hard to make. I mean, I think it's very hard to make a long-form documentary like that without also getting caught up in the kind of the tension there is always inherent in documentary of, you know, is it entertainment or is it fact? And when you have to pace it out in that way over several hours or whatever, the temptation is, I think, to make it more entertainment. And we're all struggling with that, in making documentaries. How entertaining should it be? How much responsibility do I have to the people? And I think it's maybe the long form. It's harder to, maybe you go over a line with that more easily. Did you like it?
The whole bourbon thing at the end just I was fascinated the whole time.
Right.
Because it was just such a...
He's such a weird, interesting character.
A weird guy, and to allow himself... I don't even understand his take, that did he think he was going to exonerate himself? I don't understand even what his motivation was.
Yeah.
For maybe to reveal the truth at the end. I had no idea.
Yeah.
But it was a ride.
Yeah.
Hi, Kevin. Do you have like a list of projects you plan to complete before you retire? And if you do, how 100% sure are you going to be able to do them before you? And if not, or do you just have them as they come by?
I'm hoping to retire after this project, personally. I have been through a sort of period in my life of just doing too many things, I think, of doing lots and lots of stuff, just because I was enjoying it, I suppose. And I think now I'm going to take go a bit more slowly. And I have got a few things that I want to do, a few projects I want to do, both a documentary project and a couple of fiction films that I'd like to do at some point, but they're not things that I'm rushing out to do. Yeah.
Other questions from the audience? There's one down here.
And a statement.
I'll start with the statement. The statement is, I'm one of the people that submitted footage for Life in a Day.
Oh, is your footage in the film?
Yeah.
Oh,
So,
what is your footage?
the bacon.
Ah.
So my question is, of all the footage I send in, I don't even know how many hours, like obviously over the day, right? So I send in probably a couple hours of footage.
Yeah.
So how, was there like sort of a thought process of where do we go or where do we start, or are there like a certain things that you were looking for, or was just people were just sort of picking up clips that they liked and they strung them together?
No,
like, how did it
what
work?
happened was we said to all the assistant editors, give everything a star system. So if it's 5 stars, it's the most incredible piece of footage you've ever seen, and it's going to be in the movie. And if it's 4 stars, it's pretty great. And if it's 3 stars, there's some interesting shots in there, and so on down to 1 star, which is, this filmmaker should never be allowed to hold a camera again, basically. And then they also logged everything. So they would have logged, footage of breakfast being prepared, and they would say, eggs fried, eggs boiled, and they put all those things into a database, and then I basically watched about 150 hours of material, which was all the 5, 4, and 3 star stuff. And then from that, really, from watching that with Joe, the editor, we very quickly put together what the shape of the film was. It seemed to be obvious to us in some way what the kind of poetic, what the footage was trying to say in some way. And so we threw together the main parts of it, and then we would say, oh, we need a shot of a boiling egg here, so let's look up in the database, and we'd find the shot of the boiling egg, and we'd probably find, of a boiling egg, you'd probably find 55 shots, or a bacon frying.
Oh, my bacon got.
Yeah, so yours was probably.
Was like a good.
It was probably the best bacon. It was the best shot bacon in the world on that day, and so that was how we did it.
Okay.
So thank you.
I always wondered, yeah.
Because it's a strange thing to at the end of the film we put directed by me, and then I think there were 357 other names of other people who had shot things. So your name is obviously there.
That's very cool.
That's brilliant.
I have 2 questions. Is this on? The first question is, in the TV series, who have you cast as JFK and who have you cast as Jackie? And the second question is, your grandfather has had a Hungarian background. Can you speak about that influence?
Well, fortunately, JFK doesn't really appear in, and neither does Jackie. We see their backs, which is a fail-safe way of approaching these things. So no, they don't really feature. They don't really feature in it. Hungarian background. Well. My grandfather was Hungarian Jewish, and he was grew up in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, born in 1902, and he, like a lot of people, found himself at the end of the First World War, the part of Austro-Hungary that he was living in, which was called Timișoara, became Timișoara in Romania, because they basically gave away to the Allies most of the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the end of the war. I think it was the Trianon Treaty it was called, and so he found himself Romanian, and then there was a lot of tension, I think, between Romanians and Hungarians, and so that was why he left, actually, and he went to Germany to be educated, and he ended up as a tramp on the streets of Berlin for 2 years, and he started writing stories to keep warm in the post office. If you went into the post office, they had all these forms, to fill out, to send parcels and stuff, and if you were in the post office trying to keep warm in the winter, just standing around, they'd throw you out. The Germans being the Germans, And I'm insulting everybody tonight, aren't I? But if you were writing something, if it looked like you could stay in there. So he started writing short stories on the back of these forms in the post office, and then he would just send them off. There were publications, newspapers, and things that would accept short stories in those days, and. The story goes, and he told me this himself, I can't quite believe it's true, but he said he was sending in these stories, and he had a little tiny bit of money one day that he'd found from somewhere, and he went to a cafe and he ordered, which apparently was the tramp's favorite thing to order in a cafe, which was a glass of hot milk. And you could get the hot milk, and then you would empty the entire sugar bowl into the milk and stir it up and drink that, and that was like food for the day. And so he did this, and as he was slurping this disgusting concoction, he noticed somebody was reading the paper in the opposite, somebody was reading a newspaper in the table opposite him, and he looked and he saw his name in the paper, and they'd published his story. And of course he didn't have an address or anything, so they didn't know, where to, who to get in touch with. So he rushed to the newspaper office and said, that's my story. It was in the paper today. Give me the money. And he got a check, and then he started writing more stories. And I found that story, actually. I found the story that he wrote that day, that he said that happened to him and it's a lovely story called Traveling. It's a little kind of Maupassant-like tale. And then he started doing the same thing, really, sending in scripts to the film company, UFA, the big film company in Germany, and one of those got accepted, and he got hooked up with a director called Robert Siodmak, who came to America and was one of the great film noir directors. And he worked then in Germany with a wonderful selection of Billy Wilder, Fred Zinnemann, Max Offel. He wrote Max Offel's his first film, and a couple of films with Siodmak before leaving in 1933 with The Rise of Hitler. Again, another great. He had all these stories, which I don't know if are true or not really, but he said he got told by the production manager on the film he was working on, who was a member of the Nazi Party, they're going to pick you up tomorrow, so leave. And he left his apartment, left the key in the door, left the car in the garage, got on the night train to Paris, and never went back.
Thank you. That's one.
Sorry, that was just like not really about Hungary.
You talked about your problem with the Mick Jagger movie, and
Yeah.
I was wondering if you ever experienced something like that before, where they kind of like took away the film from you, and how you dealt with it, and if it changed your attitude since then.
That's really the only time I've experienced that where I think I was kind of naive, and I was also just excited to be making a film with Mick Jagger, to be honest, and I didn't really think about the consequences of not having final cut, and not having final cut when the final cut resides with a capricious rock star, and who's very nice, by the way, and I had a great time with him, and swanning around the world in private jets and things, and made the mistake of thinking he was my friend, and then made a documentary which showed a sort of rounded version of his character, and then he hated it, and mostly because he looked old, and I sort of wanted to say, well, you are old. That's why you look old, and but funnily enough, we're working together on something else again now.
You have Final Cut?
No, it's not about the Rolling Stones. We're actually trying together to make a film about the young Elvis Presley, and he's the producer, or one of the producers on it, and that's been a totally fascinating experience because, of course, if anybody can really understand what Elvis Presley's psyche was like when he's starting his career, it's someone like him, who's come from the same place in a way, and started as young and was as huge a star as Elvis. So he's got very interesting psychological insights into Elvis and insights into the dance moves. He said, "Oh yeah, I used to do that in my bedroom in Croydon. That's a mirror move," he'd say. That's one which you adopt in the mirror when you're doing it for yourself. And then Elvis that's why he apparently stops like this, because he did it in the mirror and he had to check out what he looked like. According to Mick Jagger.
Are there other questions?
Wasn't Mick Jagger also involved in the James Brown film?
Yes.
That was ironic because James Brown was offended that Mick Jagger got better billing on the Tammy show.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Can you talk about that?
Well, no, not really. It's not anything to do with me. But I do know that Mick told me that he admired James Brown enormously, and that's why he wanted to do the film, because he was a huge influence on him. And I think the Rolling Stones, as with a lot of British rock acts at that time, and I guess American acts, owe so much to black acts at that time who didn't really get the acknowledgement that they should have gotten. I think that's partly was his motivation for making that film, to sort of pay back in a little way. It seemed like.
There's a question in the back.
Hi, I'm just curious, because you have experience working in documentary and both in documentary and fiction. What is your approach with your, I guess, subjects versus actors? And can you talk a little bit about how you direct both?
Yeah. Well, with the subjects, I suppose my philosophy is that if somebody doesn't say no to you, they want to be filmed. And most people, when you approach them to make a film with that, like in the case of Touching the Void, they don't say no. They say, call me again in a month, or write me a letter, or something. And I've sort of come to think over years of doing documentaries that always means that really they want to do it. And it's the only people, and it's just about how much time and energy you have to put into persuading them. And the only people who really don't want to be interviewed are the people who, when you phone them out and say, no, I'm not doing it. And very rarely, if somebody says, no, I'm not doing it, and puts the phone down, you can never persuade them. But that is like 2% of people. Almost everybody wants to be on camera, and it's just presenting it to them in the right way. Because I guess it's a great affirmation in some ways, isn't it? And I think everyone wants to have their side of the story told in some way. So a lot of time with subjects, is spent, not befriending them, because you don't want to befriend them, but trying to persuade them to do what they want to do anyway, in some way. That actually that it's usually people are fearful of speaking out, fearful of what they might reveal about themselves. But at the same time, we all want to understand ourselves in some way, and I think that being in a documentary helps you understand yourself in some way. And what I do find, though, is that sometimes when you present the film to people and you present a different version of themselves than the one that they have in their own head of what, how they see themselves, and people can get very upset. But there is that uncomfortable moral position with all documentaries, isn't there, that you feel like you're using people's lives, and so you have to be responsible, and you have to draw your own lines about what is acceptable and what's not acceptable in the way of using somebody, and what you're prepared to put in and what you're not prepared to put in. But with actors, when I directed Last King of Scotland, I'd literally never. Well, I directed a school play when I was 15, and it was a bomb, and that was the only directing I'd ever done before I directed Last King of Scotland, and I didn't really know how to talk to actors, and I was very intimidated by them because I didn't understand what it was they were doing really, and how they were doing it. And I suppose that I still have that sense of them. When you work with a great actor, you can only your jaw drops with wonder at the mystery of what they do, that they can transform themselves into somebody else convincingly, that they can inhabit a different character. And great actors are they're sort of geniuses in some way. You can't figure out how they do what they do. And I think often they don't know how they do what they do. It's very rarely rationalized. But it took me a long time, I suppose, just to realize. And it was one of the things that I remember Danny Boyle said to me in my half-hour film school was that, actors are just people, which is a sort of, cliche and obvious, but actually, to realize that you just talk to them in the same way as you talk to anybody else. And you start to realize, what things are useful to say to actors and what are not useful to say to actors. And I think a lot of the best directors hardly talk to their actors at all. And somehow or other they get the performance they want from the atmosphere they create and from what the script is like and from non-verbal kind of means. And I often think, and that sometimes, the temptation is to go and say to an actor, oh, can you try it a bit more like this? And then if you do that before they've had a couple of goes at their own way of doing it, you just throw their performance off. And good actors usually, they might do a couple of takes that don't work and then they'll find it. And often the best thing is just to wait and let them do it, But occasionally you can be useful by saying, oh no, I think you're misunderstanding this line or you're misunderstanding this scene in this way. But I think those things are very simple and very human things, that are not talking psychologically so much. That's my experience.
Are there other questions? I have a question about, there are a lot of filmmakers in this audience, and you're talking a little bit about the need for theatrical distribution, or that was the hunger when you first started. So to kind of go full circle, thinking about the current state of theatrical distribution of independent film, what do you see as the opportunities and challenges in the digital?
Well, I think it is really difficult, to find a space for smaller films in the theatrical world these days. And it's obviously that's not saying anything new or original, but it's harder and harder to get the kinds of films I've been making, sort of smaller budget films, to be seen by enough people theatrically to make them commercially viable. And the big blockbusters are doing fine, and they're sort of expanding, and they're becoming a different kind of film experience. It's pure sort of sensation in a way. And anything that's not that is very, very hard. And obviously there are some breakout hits, but the general thing is that there's so many films released, there's a lot of films made, and most of them don't make any money and don't make enough money back to justify making another film. So I think that is difficult, and that's why places like this are so fantastic, showing a huge variety of films from around the world and allowing people to experience a wider cinematic culture than the one that is the mainstream blockbuster culture. And it would be a very sad day if that sort of breadth of film is not available theatrically for people. Because for me, theatrical is still, that's the alpha experience. That's the great. That's the reason film is film. And watching things on your iPad or your television can be great, but it's not the same thing as cinema, as seeing something on the big screen, experiencing it with other people. and entering that kind of dream state, which you do only when you see a good film.
Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Thank you all for coming on a very sunny, bright day. Please join me in thanking our guest, Kevin Macdonald.
Thank you very much. Thank you.